Support comes from Mosby Building Arts, providing exterior solutions for homes with faded, cracked, or outdated siding. Details at callmosby.com.
From St. Louis Public Radio. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jason Rosenbaum. Later in the hour, we'll check in with St. Louis Public Radio's Sarah Kellogg about how Republicans in Missouri are trying to regroup after the failure of Amendments 4 and 5. And we'll also examine how some national Democrats are pushing for a campaign finance overhaul in the run-up to the 2026 election cycle. But first, Missouri's Children's Division is on the verge of a major overhaul. Workers who look into alleged child abuse and neglect will transition into more specialized roles on September 1st with the goal of reducing a traditionally high caseload. It's also aimed at steering more experienced workers to jobs where they can make more money and assist newer investigators with complicated cases. This transition is coming at a challenging time for Children's Division. Data from the Department of Social Services show that caseloads for investigators are going up again, including in the St. Louis region. Steph Quinn covers social services for the Missouri Independent. She's the author of an article that came out this week detailing the rising caseloads for investigators and heartburn over the Children's Division restructuring. Steph, welcome to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
Thanks for having me.
Your article detailed that caseloads for investigators have gone up in more parts of the state. What numbers in particular caught your attention?
Yeah, some of the highest numbers are in St. Louis County and St. Louis City. Most recently, looking at the most recent data that's available on the Children's Division's dashboard for that area, in July, the average number of cases that a worker had open for child abuse and neglect investigations was 97 in St. Louis County. That was the highest in the state, and 58 in St. Louis City, which I believe was the second highest.
Was there any reasons that people gave you why St. Louis in particular was high?
No, I'm actually not totally sure why St. Louis in particular is high. The workers that I spoke with talked a lot about new rules and policies that have been introduced, I think with the aim of preventing mistakes from being made and making sure kids are staying safe. But the workers that I talked to said that these policies mean that cases take longer to close, and can also take workers away from, really building close relationships with kids and their families and learning about those families' specific needs.
Can you give some examples of some of these new rules that some of the case workers you talked with have found delay closing a case more often?
Sure. So there's a type of meeting called a team decision-making meeting. These involve parents. They involve, I think, the child, if they're old enough, the caseworker, the person's supervisor from Children's Division, the juvenile officer. And workers told me that the goal of those really was to engage parents in the assessment or investigative process. There was a message that was sent out to workers not too long ago, within the past year, saying that, I guess essentially narrowing the times when workers were able to use that kind of tool. So I guess that wasn't so much adding a new rule as subtracting a tool, but there have been new forms that require workers to document all the steps they took when they were trying to find relatives. For supervisors, there are new checklists, like really detailed checklists for supervisor consults. There's a new requirement, or relatively new requirement, that when workers use a risk assessment tool to assess like the chances that a child could be subject to abuse or neglect in the future, if the family scores high or very high, and they don't recommend either services or the child's removal, they have to meet with their supervisor and go over it. And workers say that they're already overloaded, and these extra steps, they say, don't necessarily make kids safer or help them connect families with the resources that they need. And as I was saying earlier, they mean that it takes longer to close cases.
Did the people you talked with provide any rationale why Children's Division was doing this? And I'm only going from an assumption here. My thought may be that since juvenile officers are responsible for triggering the judicial process to remove children from a home, they may just want as much information and evidence as possible. And it's just possible that some of the new steps you mentioned is a way to give the juvenile officer a stronger case, especially if they have to do a removal.
Yeah, I think that's definitely fair to say. I think the intention is definitely to ensure that there's more consistency in how cases are, handled throughout the state, to make sure workers have consistent guidance about how they should approach cases. So I think that is the intention, but I also am hearing from workers that there's a disconnect, perhaps, between that intention and the way things are playing out on the ground.
Yeah, and I mention that because one of the struggles that investigators face is that they often have to act quickly if a child is in imminent danger, either because of physical or sexual abuse or extreme neglect. But I can tell you, whenever I write anything about Children's Division, I get emails from people who claim their child was separated from them unfairly or that Children's Division made a bunch of mistakes. So I guess to play devil's advocate, couldn't it be argued that a rigorous process is aimed at making sure the strongest case is being built if a child, especially if a child removal order gets sent to a juvenile officer?
Yeah, I hear that argument. I guess I would just say that one thing I've heard is that when these kind of administrative tasks and, like paperwork piling up, that, as those things pile up, workers are getting new hotline calls, and, some of them are emergencies. And they're saying that it becomes more difficult, and they don't necessarily have the discretion to prioritize and, make sure, that, new hotlines that they get in, they're making sure those kids are actually safe without having to worry about all this paperwork, but also that, keeping cases open longer, it means that Children's Division is intervening longer in families' lives. And in some of those cases, they say, kids actually were safe.
So this caseload increase that you reported about is coming at a time when Children's Division is restructuring their child abuse and neglect investigation department. Children's Division Director Sarah Smith talked with us earlier this year about the change, and she contends it will ultimately result in investigators having more manageable workloads.
We hear a lot from team members that are still boots on the ground with us, and team members that have unfortunately left because the job is too much. They're not getting the right professional path. They're out on potentially an investigation just coming out of training. And we need to make sure that we're equipping them to be able to handle those investigations. So we're rolling out several specialized teams that team members statewide are filling out surveys for where they feel that they are most applicable to fit in and do the work. So our newborn crisis assessment team, chronic neglect team, sexual abuse investigations, a mobile unit to provide assistance statewide, general investigations, general assessments, and then also our critical investigations unit and out-of-home investigations units, which are already established.
That was Children's Division Director Sarah Smith on the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air earlier this year. Steph, what are people telling you about the upcoming restructuring that is slated to take effect in a couple of weeks?
Yep. So I think there's definitely a hope that it will be helpful. At the same time, I think that workers are a little bit apprehensive. They're not totally sure that it will help with overwhelming caseloads because it doesn't involve hiring more frontline workers. There are a couple of new positions that are managerial, but yeah, I mean, I heard some doubt from workers that this will.
It seems like we're having connection problems with Steph Quinn of the Missouri Independent. Steph, are you back?
Yes.
Yeah. You were saying about the reaction among workers to this restructuring. If you could continue what you were saying.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so I think workers are hopeful that this will help make caseloads more manageable and help make it easier to close investigations within the 45 days that's in the law. But at the same time, I think workers are a little bit apprehensive. They say that, things have been a little bit chaotic lately, and they're worried about, more change. And they aren't sure that this plan will help because it doesn't involve hiring more frontline workers. I think it's also worth saying that it's kind of a centralization in that frontline workers will be reporting to more regional, specialized team leaders rather than supervisors who are in their county or circuit. And from what I've heard, those relationships with county supervisors are really key. So I think there are some nerves about this reorganization and what it'll mean on the ground.
Interestingly, when I asked Smith about what the reaction was to this restructuring, she mentioned to me that it wasn't being universally well received. Here is Sarah Smith again earlier this year on the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
So having an organization of almost 2,000 team members throughout the state, 46 judicial circuits with a variety of tenure, honestly, I've gotten a mixed bag. So I've received lots of feedback and emails excited for the change, thanking for a bold step, something different, something that is more manageable for them, specifically around the on-call. That is something we've heard a lot of positive feedback about, not only from our investigators, but also from our other program lines that have been pitching in to cover on-call. And so that is one piece that they're really excited about, is reducing the number of hours on call. And then we have some team members that until they're placed in their teams, and they've had the option to select their team, and then we'll look at how many we need. They are able to rank those choices between the teams that are fit within their tenure. I think they'll feel more assured when they know their team and their supervisor, which will be over. We wanted to bring them along for the next couple months and build that with them, reset, retrain. And so once they have those specific coverage areas and supervisor, I think those are the main things that they want to know. And I want to make sure that they're able to have that as soon as possible.
That again was Sarah Smith, the director of Children's Division, talking about how the agency is restructuring its child abuse and neglect investigation department. In addition to just reacting to what she said several months ago, do you have any understanding if Children's Division is trying to hire more workers to make sure that some of the concerns you heard from caseworkers don't materialize once this restructuring occurs?
So I don't have totally updated information. The Department of Social Services actually declined to answer questions for the story that we're talking about. But back in January, when some of these plans were being put in place, I had received a response from the department saying that they were making use of historic vacancies in the department to create these specialized teams, and that the intention was to use existing resources to manage workload more efficiently. So my understanding is that there aren't immediate plans to increase the number of frontline workers, but that also might not be the most updated information.
Steph Quinn writes about social services for the Missouri Independent. Steph, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
When we come back, we'll dive into America's broken campaign finance system and examine some potential changes that could engender more trust and transparency. But before that break, one last reminder about this evening's special event happening in the Public Media Commons right outside our station. We'll have a screening of the short documentary Red Brick, Blue Tarp by St. Louis filmmaker Cami Thomas. It features visual poetry and firsthand interviews to explore people's experiences and the aftermath of last May's EF3 tornado. This is a free all-ages screening, and stick around afterward because Elaine Shaw will talk with director Cami Thomas. The event starts at 7:30. You can RSVP at stlpr.org/events and bring a chair. It's comfy to sit on chairs. We'll be right back. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
Support comes from Poetry for All, a conversational podcast introducing poetry of all sorts to all sorts of people, like Walt Whitman's Learned Astronomer, dropping now wherever you get podcasts. poetryforallpod.com.
Welcome back to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jason Rosenbaum. America's campaign finance system is a failure. I know. You're probably thinking that's a declarative and subjective statement, especially coming from a journalist who barely got a B- in math class. But objectively speaking, the federal system that regulates how campaign money is raised and spent is just not working. For decades, candidates have had to abide by strict donation limits to their campaigns, while political action committees that support them can take unlimited amounts of money from a donor. It is perfectly legal for candidates to participate in fundraisers for PACs that could support their campaigns or oppose their opponents' campaigns. That creates a system that honestly feels like a farce or a charade. Elections aren't less expensive under this system either. In fact, here's how Michigan U.S. Senator Elissa Slotkin, a Democrat, reacted when she was told earlier this week in Midtown St. Louis that several U.S. Senate races in 2026 could eclipse more than $1 billion in spending.
I don't know how Missouri feels about swearing. Missouri's pretty good. I'm a little worried. I know, but the Midwest has, we all know. Is it all right? Is it right? Okay, that's what we call in the business crazy. $1 billion is crazy.
Slotkin was attending an event sponsored by End Citizens United and Stand Up America, two progressive-leaning groups that want to, among other things, overhaul the nation's campaign finance system. And the fact that Slotkin uttered profanity to describe the role of money in American politics is pretty telling. The lawmaker represented one of the most competitive House districts in America before narrowly winning an extremely close Senate race in 2024. So her races have been quite costly. And like me, she doesn't have a particularly positive opinion about the federal campaign finance system.
A complete farce. I mean, I call it a Frankenstein. It is a patchwork of horrible, different decisions and laws and rulings that have created the worst campaign finance system we could have made up. If there's one thing I would do to change our politics, it would be to change our campaign finance system.
Now, before anyone starts gnashing their teeth and writing angry typewritten letters to me, let me be as direct as possible. There are right-wing political action committees that influence campaigns and left-wing political action committees that influence campaigns. all sorts of ideologies use politically active nonprofits to affect elections without disclosing who is funding them. And there's not one campaign finance-related proposal or idea that is going to completely eradicate outside groups from participating in the electoral process, whether it be the crypto industry, companies that make artificial intelligence, or supporters of Israel. But even with all of these caveats, that does not change the reality that America's campaign finance system contains easily circumventable limits and creates incentives to make money very difficult to track. So I asked Slotkin what she would do to make things better.
The way that you handle this is you change the way people get elected and you change what they're allowed to do when they're elected. So to get elected, first of all, get rid of partisan gerrymandering across the country, make it illegal, and then ban corporate PACs, period, and make it illegal to have dark money involved in our elections, meaning you have to actually know who's donating the money and in what way. And to me, until you start fundamentally changing the system so that big sums of money can't just be dumped on a campaign, the rest is more or less window dressing. So, and then when people get in office, they can't enrich themselves. There's actual real penalties if they use the office to enrich themselves.
Some of the things that Slotkin mentioned here could happen on a state-by-state basis, but would likely go nowhere federally unless Democrats retake Congress and the White House. Even then, banning things like partisan gerrymandering would need to go through the Senate, which is notoriously tough for ideas with serious opposition. Tiffany Muller of End Citizens United told me another intriguing idea, a public financing system for campaigns, something that countries like Canada have done for many years. This is not a universally beloved idea, especially since there's some squeamishness with using taxpayer dollars for political electioneering. Mueller says an American public financing system could be funded with a tax on political action committees or fines on corporations.
Cockroaches are more popular than members of Congress, and the faith and trust in our government to address the big problems that we're facing is almost nil. We have to figure out a way to actually put the incentives back on the side of public officials working for the public again. And public financing, what we have seen in the states and the municipalities that have implemented it, is one of the best ways to do it. However, let's say we don't do it. Fine. Great. Get rid of the super PACs, get rid of the 501c4s, get rid of the unlimited and undisclosed funding. This idea that money equals speech is root cause of our problem.
That money equals speech line references a philosophy that a lot of Republicans have subscribed to for years. It's at the heart of the Citizens United decision, which allows corporations and unions to make unlimited independent expenditures in campaigns. Overturning that decision would require either the Supreme Court to reverse itself or a constitutional amendment, two things that are just not happening right now. Some Republicans have suggested a radically different approach, getting rid of campaign donation limits to candidates. As former State Senator Bill Eigel noted to me earlier this year, Missouri had this unlimited system before the passage of a 2016 constitutional amendment putting in place fairly strict donation limits to candidates.
Before that went into effect, we had the one thing that we could be sure of, even when a lot of money was coming in the door, and that was transparency. It was very simple. If you got a big check, the money, you had to report the big check, and then then voters could make up their mind themselves whether or not they thought those big checks were a good or a bad idea. In fact, that was relevant in my first race. If you recall, I got several large checks in that first race from an individual, David Humphreys. Mm-hmm. There were commercials made about it, and ultimately the voters got a chance to make that decision. If they felt that was a problem, they were going to vote for one of my opponents. If they felt that I had the intestinal fortitude to withstand the pressure from those checks, they were going to vote for me, and they made that decision.
To be clear, this system that Eigel described did not stop big donors from using PACs or politically active nonprofits that conceal their contributions. But he is absolutely correct that it made big donations easier to track, since they were often going directly to candidates as opposed to PACs with nondescript or vague names. A lot of political candidates prefer to have money going directly to them because they can control what happens to it. But even some Missouri Republicans who voted to remove campaign donation limits in the late 2000s concede it created unintended consequences. That includes former state senator Jason Crowell, who represented several southeast Missouri counties. Crowell started his political career under a limited system and ended it when he could get donations of unlimited size. Here's what he told me in 2015.
It's a complete different dynamic when you first get elected and you have to build the relationships and knock on the doors and do everything to raise X amount of dollars at that level. You're touching a lot of people, and then you're leaving your cell phone, you're hearing ideas.
Given how unpopular the unlimited system was with Missouri Democrats, I asked people like Slotkin and Mueller whether raising the limits that someone could donate to campaigns to, say, $25,000 per election would incentivize people to give to candidates instead of PACs. Neither thought that idea would work, especially as Mueller pointed out, since PACs would still be a tempting option for large donors.
Here's what I think you would get if you just went to a $25,000 system. You would have billionaires giving candidates $25,000 and then turning around and giving super PACs $10 million. Right now, we know that 75% of super PAC funding is coming from 100 billionaires, right? That is obscene, especially when we're talking numbers of $20 billion that were spent in 2024. So we actually just have to get rid of that completely.
I asked Slotkin how realistic it was to make these types of campaign finance changes, even if Democrats retake Congress and the presidency in 2029. As I mentioned before, getting things through the Senate is hard, especially with a filibuster that requires 60 votes to pass anything. Slotkin says big campaign finance changes can be done, but it requires buy-in from Republicans.
Well, look, some of that stuff we've already voted on when I was in the House. I mean, it can be legislated and should be legislated the minute we take back the House and the Senate. Now, we need Republicans who actually also believe in campaign finance reform, which is harder to find. But in my mind, these are things that can be legislated, and that's the way our system works. Supreme Court makes decisions through their rulings. The only way to push back on that is to legislate.
Given Congress's propensity for perpetual gridlock, it's hard to be optimistic about creating a campaign finance system with rules that promote ethics and public transparency. But one thing is for sure, legislative inaction will only make an already broken system even more broken. We need to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll talk with STLPR's Sarah Kellogg about how Republicans are regrouping after a tough primary election season. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. Welcome back to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jason Rosenbaum. It's the middle of August in an election year, and that means that state and federal politicians have descended on Sedalia for the Missouri State Fair. For Missouri Republicans, this state fair season may be a little less festive. Earlier this month, Missourians rejected two of the party's biggest priorities, making it harder to pass some constitutional amendments and expanding sales and use taxes as a way to eliminate the income tax. But even though these measures failed in every single part of the state by eye-popping margins, GOP leaders are pressing on to the general election. But it remains to be seen if Republicans can regain their footing in some key state legislative races, especially with a less than stellar national environment for the GOP. St. Louis Public Radio State House and politics reporter Sarah Kellogg was at the State Fair on Thursday for the governor's ham breakfast, and she joins us now to talk about Republican confidence going into November, as well as court decisions over 2 major ballot initiatives. Sarah, welcome to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
Hi, Jason. Good to be back.
How are Missouri Republicans feeling after the dismal failure of Amendment 4 and Amendment 5?
I think they're understanding that maybe they need to take a step back on those issues, but I don't think they feel defeated. I think ultimately the sentiment was that, well, maybe Missourians would still like these ideas. They just did not like the particular plans that were in place. So I think that they're kind of, obviously they wanted a different outcome, but I don't think that means that they're going to stop pressing on the issues that were Amendment 4 and 5.
To detail this a little bit more colorfully, I want to play an exchange between you and State Senator Curtis Gregory, a Republican from beautiful and scenic Saline County.
We are coming a couple weeks off the primary where voters pretty soundly rejected Amendments 4 and 5. What did you make of that election?
You mean that you call that soundly?
80% yeah. A spanking?
I would say soundly is probably pretty accurate. You know, I don't think the proposals were bad. I mean, I guess it depends on what side of the spectrum you're on, but at one point in time, Democrats, when they were in control, they tried to do something with initial petition reform, probably for the same reasons. Maybe that was a little more forward-thinking than us, and we're maybe a little more reactive. But, you know, the concerns I heard was it's just too restrictive. And why doesn't it apply to the legislature also? Those were some of the same concerns I had, but this was a clear path to finally get something on the ballot, something I voted on, I think it was at 5 years by the time we put that on the ballot last summer. So it was 5 years, something I'd voted on. And we finally had a path to get something on the ballot for the people to choose for, and they chose. And at the end of the day, that's what matters to me. Same thing with Amendment 5. People have always wanted income tax reform. We finally had a governor grab the bull by the horns, put a proposal together. And again, same way, some of the same concerns that I had in thinking about it were the same things I heard on the campaign trail, but this was the path. We all agreed, let's put this on the ballot. And it was kind of funny. People would almost tell me they're voting against it to get under my skin, and I'm going, okay, that's fine. That's your choice. Like, you get to vote against this if you want to, but let me explain to you how this will work and why we're doing it. And a lot of those people, I could turn their minds, but you just can't have that conversation with, 2 million voters.
That was Senator Curtis Gregory, a Republican from Saline County, talking with St. Louis Public Radio's Sarah Kellogg yesterday at the Missouri State Fair. First of all, Sarah, that was one of my favorite exchanges I've heard in recent weeks and months, so thank you for making my day.
You're welcome.
What did you make of that explanation from Senator Gregory?
I think in some aspects, I think he's definitely pecking at what maybe some voters were saying. I think that we brought up a couple times to, certain events that there was a big dislike of the fact that with Amendment 4, with the restrictions that they put on citizen-led initiatives, they didn't have for lawmakers. He said that's something that he himself didn't really like. And I think that ultimately that version, I think, is universally agreed at this point to be too strict. And I think that there might be a version, in the future where maybe I know one year I think it was 56%. I know later in our conversation he mentioned maybe just a concurrent, so maybe a 5 out of 8 congressional districts along with the 50+1. So I think that, the idea of having a greater explanation, like that being too strict, I think was definitely a issue with 4. Regarding 5, he mentioned like the clamoring for income tax reform. I don't know if that's what's top of mind for most Missourians. I know that other Republicans, Democrats will say property taxes or even personal property taxes might be a little more pressing than the income tax. But I do think that ultimately because there wasn't a set plan, I think that there was a lot of opportunity for the opposition to say, well, it's going to do this, this, and this, because there just wasn't that ability. And he's right, maybe by talking to people, he was able to get a different opinion across. But ultimately, like you said, there was just too many people that you had to convince, and ultimately people didn't buy it. By the way, you can give us a call with your questions about Missouri politics. Call us at 314-382-8255. That's 314-382-TALK. So Governor Mike Kehoe was asked if the 80% plus no votes on these 2 amendments made him hesitant to revisit efforts to curtail the initiative petition process or eliminate the income tax. Here is what he had to say about that.
Yeah, we've talked to a lot of Missourians afterwards, many at the state fair, who said, don't give up, keep going, keep trying. Missouri, if you ask the average Missourian, do you want to keep more of your money, their answer is going to be yes. We didn't maybe communicate the plan very well, or the package wasn't put together right. It doesn't mean I don't stop. The best hitter in baseball is a 300 hitter. So we're going to keep trying.
That was Governor Mike Kehoe talking about the demise of Amendments 4 and 5 at the State Fair in Sedalia. Sarah, do you think the legislature tries again on either of these issues, given how big the margins of defeat were?
Well, so ultimately, I do think that lawmakers are going to try again, but I think the 80% margins, 4 failed with 80%, 5 failed with 83% saying no. I think that big of a margin means they don't try again immediately. I spoke with Representative Alex Riley, who is expected to be the speaker next year, and he pretty much said, Republicans run on tax cuts, and but then he kind of mentioned property taxes, personal property taxes. I don't think he took income taxes off the board, but I think, he said there's a lot of regrouping that needs to happen with both Amendments 4 and 5's failure. Same thing with making it harder to amend the Missouri Constitution. That's something Republicans have wanted for years. They get something on the ballot, it fails with 80%. I think that requires a regrouping. So I think we'll see it again, but I don't think it's going to be right away.
The big question is whether the failure of these initiatives will carry on into November. Senator Eric Schmitt doesn't seem to think so, primarily because of the structure of the state's 2026 election cycle.
There's not a lot of general election races, in Missouri. There's really only one statewide. It's kind of an unusual year in that way. I think that only happens once every 12 years or so. So this state fair and this ham breakfast has a little bit of a different feel. You don't have all the candidates you typically have who are running. But I'm going to do everything I can, obviously getting around the country, campaigning for people so we hold the majority in the U.S. Senate.
That was GOP U.S. Senator Eric Schmitt talking at the State Fair in Sedalia about Missouri GOP prospects. Sarah, he's not wrong. This election cycle is favorable for Republicans because there's only one statewide office up for grabs, but it does seem like Democrats have an opportunity to do what they've said they would do for years, which is have more seats in the House and Senate go their way. What do you think about that?
I do think they have that opportunity. If I remember correctly, Missouri Democrats only need to flip 3 House seats to break the supermajority and then 2 in the Senate. And I think that with what this election cycle is going to be, you're right, there is only one statewide race, but I think that there's a lot of motivated Democrats. And I think that that could cause some flips for sure. And ultimately, I think that Democrats are really trying to hang their hats on the failures of 4 and 5 and dragging the Republicans who voted for them along with them. And so I think that they do see this as a big opportunity for them to make inroads. I think, the auditor's race is a hard win for them, but I do think that they're going to see the opportunities elsewhere in both those down ballot races as well as amendments.
We'll talk more specifically about one particular race in a moment, but Donna from Baldwin, welcome to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. What's on your mind?
Hello. I'm happy to be here. I'm an avid listener, and I appreciate this hour. I just feel that our legislature in Missouri and our governor don't seem to want to respect what the voters decide. And I keep thinking back to that adage, isn't that the definition of insanity to keep trying the same thing, expecting different results? And it's just time for them to start paying attention to what the voters are saying at the ballot box.
Well, Donna, thank you for your call today. Sarah, anything to add to Donna's call? It seems like this November election will be a referendum of sorts on whether voters are tired of that type of legislative behavior from Republicans.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I think Republicans point to that as well. They elect us, and that's the priorities that we know we stand for, and so therefore they feel like that gives them the ability to vote the way they do because they are elected into the legislature. But I do think there are instances right now we're seeing rejections of 4 or 5, the legislature overturning the paid sick leave initiative last year. I think there is a lot of frustration right now with voters along with lawmakers. We'll see if that makes a difference in November.
Indeed, one of the people who is hoping to take advantage of the backlash over Amendments 4 and 5 is State Representative Carrie Engel, who is running for state senate in Jackson County. You caught up with her yesterday, and she's hoping that the poor national environment for Republicans ultimately trickles to Missouri.
What we're seeing nationwide since Trump was reelected, in every single special election, areas where, Democrats are winning, or not even if they're not winning, they're overperforming Kamala Harris by on average 13.5 percentage points. And so folks are really, really shifting that pendulum right now. And it has to do with the economy. It has to do with us and our involvement in foreign wars that we have no business being involved in. It has to do with, public education. It has to do with all of these different issues that affect everyone's bottom line, that affect their day-to-day lives. And people I believe that this is going to be a change election.
That was State Representative Carrie Engel, a Democrat from Lee's Summit, who is running for the state Senate. Sarah, this is the 20th anniversary of the 2006 election cycle, which is, I think, by any objective measure, the worst election cycle for Missouri Republicans of this century. They not only lost the auditor's race and a U.S. Senate race, but they lost a lot of seats in the legislature because it was just a terrible year nationally for Republicans. Do you think if Engel ends up winning against House Speaker John Patterson, who has just almost an unlimited amount of money at his disposal, that could just be an example of just the national wave is just too much for Republicans to overcome?
Yeah, I can see that. I think something that's kind of interesting about the Engel-Patterson race, and I've mentioned it, I think, on the show before, is that Patterson was one of the handlers of Amendment 5. So I think that he's kind of, and he was the speaker, I think he's kind of a very unique candidate in that way, that there's kind of a lot to hang on him as far as opposition with Carrie Engel. But I think that she's definitely an indicator. I'm also really interested to see the race in Springfield, which is obviously a little more of a purple, not that Lee Summit isn't, but I think that's a strictly purple area. And I think it'll be really interesting to see what happens there between Melanie Stennett and Representative Betsy Fogel, both House representatives running for an open seat. So I think there is a couple races that we can see that indicate how the things are going to go.
Let's go to Janet from Webster Groves. Janet, welcome to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
Thank you. I'm a big fan of you, Jason, and of the radio station. I think the message is finally getting through to the rural voters of Missouri. It's what the citizens in Kansas City and St. Louis have known for a long time. We really need to align ourselves with the elected politicians that make conditions better in Missouri. In rural areas, hospitals are closing. Schools are now down to 4-day a week. We do not pay our state workers, which a lot of state workers are in the rural areas, enough to live on. So I think the rural area is really feeling the crunch, and they're finally figuring this out, that they need to change their votes and vote for some of the Democrats because the Republicans are not bringing home the things that they need to live.
Thank you, Janet, for your comment. And we will actually talk more about that in a race that is going to get national attention on the western side of the state in a moment. But the other topic of conversation at the state fair was what else? Congressional redistricting, because on Wednesday, a Cole County judge blocked a referendum on a map aimed at ousting Democrat Emanuel Cleaver. He also blocked a proposal called Respect Missouri Voters that makes it more difficult for the legislature to overturn voter-approved initiatives. That case, but I think both of the cases now head to the Missouri Supreme Court. Here's Secretary of State Denny Hoskins talking about these lower court decisions.
I'm continuing to bat 1,000. I went 3 for 3 this week. We continue to win, and so I know some of the folks out there don't like it. They don't want me to follow state law. They don't want me to follow Missouri Constitution. Well, I'm not going to do that, and it doesn't matter how loud they are. I will not be deterred. I'm going to do my job. I'm going to do my job as the chief election official here in the state of Missouri.
That was Missouri Secretary of State Denny Hoskins talking about the Cole County court decisions that went in his direction. Sarah, you were in the courthouse several times this week. What was sort of your reaction to the Judge Green's decisions on the redistricting referendum and the Respect Missouri Voters initiative?
Ultimately, I don't think the parties were surprised at Judge Green's ruling. I think, and also, not that it doesn't matter because that is the step that gets it to the Supreme Court, but everyone knows these were going to the Supreme Court. And I think that's ultimately where we're going to see maybe a difference of opinion regarding what Hoskins is saying and what the plaintiffs in the cases are expecting. So I think we'll see. It'll be interesting. I have no idea, after what we saw with this precedent ruling, where the court's going to go. But I think that there's valid arguments kind of for each side and certain specific points of it. And so I think, Republicans are obviously hoping these rulings stand, and Democrats are hoping for flips when it comes to both of these cases.
Yeah, I am done predicting what the courts are going to do, so do not ask me that question.
Well, I do want to say, I know we talk, I feel amiss to not mention Airbud, but I think that's the big question is, well, the Supreme Court allowed redistricting because there wasn't anything that said they couldn't, and now, the defendants in this case are saying, well, there's nothing that says that you can referendum a map. And so they're asking for the reverse order, So I think that'll be interesting to see if the court is consistent and says, nope, there's nothing saying it, so you can, or no, there's nothing saying it, you can't. I think that's a big question in that particular case.
Just want to say for the record, I did not bring up Airbud. Sarah did.
I did.
You caught up with Representative Emanuel Cleaver, who is prepared to run in a new district that is oriented toward the GOP if Judge Green's decision is sustained by the Supreme Court. Here is the Kansas City Democrat.
Well, I mean, I'm going to do it the same way I've been doing it all of my career, and that's going out representing the people. I was here yesterday. I was here last night at the dinner. And this is not my first rodeo here. So I'm not, I think, someone may have miscalculated to assume that, number one, that I couldn't represent a rural area, and then number two, that somehow people were going to think this was okay, and they don't. The polling shows it.
That was Congressman Emanuel Cleaver, a Democrat who represents the 5th Congressional District. Sarah, I am not going to lie to people and say that the new map makes Cleaver anything other than the underdog in this race. But he has represented rural counties before, including for a decade Lafayette, Saline, and Ray counties. What do you make of his comments?
I mean, that was a question that was asked to Republicans and others throughout the breakfast was, well, did you make the 5th district something that Republicans can attain, or did you just make it a competitive district compared to a safe Democratic seat, which was in 2022 with the map? And so I think that ultimately this is just a much more competitive race. I don't disagree with you that Cleaver is the underdog, but we're looking at a year where Democrats are overperforming in many, many races. So ultimately he still might be able to pull it off. So I don't think it's a slam dunk as maybe some others would have believed. So I do think that there's the ability there for him to still win.
Cleaver is squaring off against State Senator Rick Bratton, and the aforementioned court case over the referendum has extraordinarily high stakes for the Cass County Republican, because if the Supreme Court reverses Cole County Judge Daniel Green, then Bratton may have to run in an unwinnable district. Here is Senator Bratton talking to reporters yesterday.
I'm going to continue running, but again, I don't feel that's going to be the case, because that's not what the Constitution, gave the sole authority to the legislature. So I'd see it very, I don't see it happening. So I'm planning for what we currently have.
That was Republican Senator Rick Bratton, the GOP nominee in Missouri's 5th district. Sarah, in the last minute we have left, I listened to the rest of the gaggle with Bratton. He says this is not going to be personal. He just wants to contrast ideas. I think that's a smart strategy. It's going to be hard to get personal against a literal reverend. And it seems if Bratton wins in the new district, it's going to be because Republicans like his ideas better. Is that sort of your take as well?
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I will say I think it's going to be hard for Cleaver to not take this personally, because ultimately this was an effort to draw him out of a district. So Bratton might not see it that way, but I don't know if Emanuel Cleaver will see it the same way.
Well, I did also see a photo of Bratton. He was wearing a hat that said Bratton on it. And I think that Cleaver, if he wants to win, needs to have a hat that says Cleaver on it. Because I unironically loved Rick Bratton's hat.
Well, you should let Emanuel Cleaver know that, and maybe we can get on a design for him that we think will work.
Every candidate running for office should have a hat with their name on it so people know who it is. But before I get down this hat rabbit hole anymore, I'm going to say goodbye to Sarah Kellogg, St. Louis Public Radio State House and Politics reporter. Be sure to read her dispatch from the State Fair at STLPR.org. Sarah, thank you again for joining us today.
Of course, Jason, always.
Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air is produced by Jason Rosenbaum, Alex Hoyer, Emily Woodbury, Danny Wissentowski, Maya Norfleet, and Elaine Cha. Audio engineering and sound design by Aaron Dorr. The politics editor is Fred Ehrlich.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations. And leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thanks.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
Hi, I'm Laura Hamden, and my colleague Jessica Rogan and I are your daily hosts of the Gateway newsletter. We meet with the editors in the STLPR newsroom every weekday to bring you the top local stories of the day in a quick and easy 6-minute read by 6 a.m. In an age of overwhelm, it's a refreshing, thoughtful take on the news day, if we do say so ourselves. Fine-tune your daily news habit with the Gateway newsletter. Subscribe at stlpr.org/gateway.